Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I am here at FN's test range in Belgium, taking a look at their brand new rifle, the FN Arca. And I think there's probably going to be a fair amount of confusion about what this rifle actually is. So it's been really interesting to get a chance to really dive down into it and get an understanding from the engineer's perspective on what the purpose of the rifle is, and that's what I want to share with you guys today. So fundamentally, the ARKA is a re-envisioning of the SCAR around a more AR-15 centric controls, handling, and exterior. So this is a rifle where the outside is largely AR-15 styled, and the inside is the mechanical system developed for the SCAR. So if you're not familiar with the backstory of the SCAR, this originates almost 25 years ago now, and it really was one of the very first modular assault rifle platform sort of systems in a way that has become pretty commonplace today, to have interchangeable barrels and different calibers and multiple different lengths available beyond just what you can do by changing the entire upper on an AR-15. And again, that's become pretty commonplace today, but the SCAR was really the rifle, one of the very few rifles that started that trend. And FN put quite a lot of development into the internal mechanism of the SCAR, because it's very much not an AR-15. It is a multi-lug, rotating bolt, short stroke gas piston system, but it is one that was specifically developed for the needs of U.S. Special Forces Command, that is the SCAR program, to be extremely reliable, as well as being efficient to manufacture and having all the other characteristics that one would want in a modern combat rifle. Well, the problem that FN ran into is over the last 20 years, they've been submitting the SCAR, or attempting to submit the SCAR, to a lot of various military and law enforcement rifle tenders, and they have found that a lot of people don't specifically want the characteristics, the external characteristics that the SCAR had. People say, tenders will say, oh, we want specifically an AR-style charging handle because we don't want to retrain all of our soldiers on a side charging handle. And that's fine, but what it means for FN is all of the qualities that they have put into the SCAR are kind of rendered moot because it had a side charging handle instead of the AR-style top-mounted T-charging handle. Similar issues with, oh, we have this specific buttstock that we want to use. Yes, the SCAR buttstock has a lot of thought that went into it, and it's a very good buttstock, but we want this specific thing that happens to be an AR buttstock because everything is AR compatible these days. And so what FN did is they said, look, we can take the fundamental core of the SCAR, the quality, the reliability that is there, and we can build it into a platform with cannons in the background that people will be, that will fit into a lot more of the tenders for people that are actually buying rifles. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at these two rifles, and let me show you how they've specifically done that. What elements of this rifle are SCAR, what elements are AR-15, and perhaps we'll wait for the cannons to finish before we do it. All right, let's start off with basic configurations. You've got two barrels, two handguards, and two colors to choose from for the ARKA. So this is similar to the SCAR, where you had multiple barrel lengths. However, they've made a very deliberate decision to make the handguard on the ARKA a separate component from the receiver. So the handguard can be changed out. If the handguard gets damaged, if you manage to mess up the M-lock attachment slots by wrenching on something a little too hard, or if there is some future compatibility that you want to integrate, the handguard can be removed and it's a separate component. Whereas on the SCAR, the receiver and the handguard were one monolithic continuous element. There are, of course, benefits to having a completely monolithic receiver and handguard, but everything in firearms design is compromise. And for for the purposes of the ARKA, it made a lot more sense to have a removable separate handguard. So this is the short handguard and short barrel. It's an 11¼ inch barrel. The longer barrel option is 14½ inch, which obviously gives you, in conjunction with this short handguard, it gives you some exposed barrel, which is sufficient to fit in a bayonet lug. The other alternative handguard option, if you have the long barrel, is a handguard that comes all the way out to here. That includes 2 extra M-lock slots on each side, out in front of the gas regulator. All right, now let's take a look at the markings. Of course, FN's logo, FN Herstal. This is caliber 5.56. These are all in 5.56. They are very non-committal about whether there will ever be any other calibers offered. I suspect the reality is if a client came to them with a specific request, they could probably facilitate it, but for the time being, it's only offered in 5.56. Serial number and date of production there. And actually, kind of just an interesting little detail, this has an aluminum lower assembly, and it specifically includes this box in the polymer mold. That is there so that on request, they can add a metal plate to actually serialize the lower, because there are some countries that would want to serialize the lower instead of the upper, or perhaps both. So they've accommodated that in their polymer mold, which is kind of cool. Now, looking at the controls, we start up here because this is really probably the single most defining change to the ARKA from the SCAR, and that is the AR style top charging handle. It is completely ambidextrous, so it can operate with either side independently. The upper assembly here is aluminum, of course, and so they've got a steel insert to work with the latch hook on the charging handle so that you don't end up wearing out the upper receiver with your charging handle. All of the other controls are also ambidextrous, so we have a 45-degree throw, 3-position safety, safe, semi, and auto. And then we have magazine release, bolt hold open, and bolt release. And those are all mirrored here on the other side, selector, mag. Here the configuration is slightly different, but if you are using this right-handed, you can reach that bolt hold open with your trigger finger, so you can pull the charging handle back, hit the bolt hold open, and lock the gun open with the minimum amount of changing of grip. Because the charging handle here does not offer you any way to proactively push the bolt forward should it get stuck, FN opted to include a forward assist, just like on the AR. You can see the little ratchet cutouts right here on the back of the bolt for the forward assist. This is a polymer element that is independent of the receiver itself. So you can see where it's screwed in place there. This is clearly added so that, in theory, if a customer came to them and said they didn't want a forward assist, it's very easy to just remove that and replace it with just some sort of standard cover plate. Now, the gun does not have a separate dust cover, specifically because it has this perfectly squared off flat bolt. And FN is of the opinion that this essentially acts as its own dust cover. Because there are no openings, there are no curved corners for dirt to get in, you don't really need a dust cover because it's already its own dust cover. Along with the T charging handle, the pistol grip and the buttstock are also very specific AR pattern elements on the rifle. These are compatible with all standard AR-15 buttstocks and pistol grips, so a customer can pick anything that's out there being manufactured and it will just drop onto the rifle. So there is a buffer tube on here. There we go. We can pull the buttstock completely off. It is an AR pattern, AR compatible, AR spec buffer tube. Ironically, there is no spring in it. It's just a hollow tube specifically for mounting AR furniture. I know some of you are going to look at this and go like, well, that's really stupid because then, you don't even have, you don't need this tube, but it means you can't have a folding stock. Well, although it is not available yet, FN does have a design that they're developing for a folding buttstock for clients who want that. But the standard version that they're beginning with is intended for AR furniture. All right, moving down towards the front of the rifle, we do have 2 screws here on either side that are holding the barrel assembly in place. On the SCAR, of course, the barrel was a user replaceable item because it was a rifle intended for high-level special operations sort of troops who could be trusted with that sort of maintenance and modification of the weapons. On the ARKA, these screws are not permanently fixed in place, but they are not intended to be user serviceable. They are armorer serviceable. So if you need to replace the barrel assembly, an armorer can do it here instead of, for example, unscrewing the barrel lock nut as you would on an AR. However, not intended to be user replaceable. All right, the handguard is attached by 2 screws, 1 on each side. Readily detachable. We'll take that off in just a moment. We have M-lock slots up here on both sides, and then 5 sets of M-locks on the handguard. So the sides, the bottom, and the 45-degree sets, and these just have rail covers in them. So everything is slots underneath the rail covers. At the front end, we have a 2-position gas regulator, but with sort of an asterisk. And the asterisk is both of the gas ports are the exact same size. So FN, having done the reliability testing on the SCAR and the 20 years of development that have gone into the SCAR, have come to the conclusion that they do not need an adverse setting. The gun runs just fine, even in adverse conditions, with its standard gas port setting. And having multiple positions actually can cause problems. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who's tinkered around with multi-position gas settings. You can easily lose track of which is which. And even in good military systems, it becomes really easy to have trainers get things backwards or otherwise mixed up, and have multiple positions actually negatively impact the practical reliability of the gun if people put them on the wrong setting. So you might be wondering, well, why would you bother to have 2 settings that are the same? And the answer is essentially future-proofing. If there is ever a situation where a client really specifically wants 2 different settings, that's fine. It can be easily retrofitted. And they need to have the adjustable system, because you have to be able to remove the gas plug out here in order to remove the gas piston to do basic maintenance on the gun. So that's why they don't just make it a totally fixed gas system. That has to come out for maintenance. So you might as well leave it with 2 separate identical positions. It just gives you some future options. And then as we get out to the very end, we have a flash hider out here that comes standard from the factory, compatible with suppressors. So FN doesn't make their own suppressors. They've done testing and evaluation on a number of different brands, and that's an ongoing process. We're going to be doing some shooting with this one today, but it's a standard, quick, like easy attachment, intended to be readily compatible with a variety of different suppressors. Now this is a flow-through suppressor, which is definitely the system that you would want to use with a single gas port setting. If you were to use a non-flow-through suppressor, the gun will still work, but it's going to increase back pressure, which means you're almost certainly going to be getting a bit more gas out the action. And the other downsides of having a non-flow-through suppressor. All right, let's go ahead and dig into some disassembly. On the SCAR, there were some complaints that you had to take a lot of stuff out. There were a bunch of steps before you could actually pull the bolt carrier out of the gun. They have changed up the disassembly mechanism here to resolve that issue. So you've got 1 pin, and it is a captive pin. We pull that out, and you can just pivot the lower down. And it opens up a little more than 90 degrees to give you really good access to the entire lower as well as the upper assembly. We then pull out the captive recoil spring. Buffer on this is a little bit thicker than on the SCAR, largely because of the different disassembly style of the gun. Once that's out, we can then pull the bolt carrier out. You do not have to remove the charging handle. It has to come back a little ways, but it can stay in the gun when you take out the bolt carrier. Let me just snap that back in. All right, we'll take a look at the bolt carrier up close in a moment, but I want to finish our disassembly here first. So we've got 1 pin at the front of the lower. We'll pull that out. That is also captive. That allows me to take the lower assembly off with the fire control group. Next up is going to be the handguard. So I've got 2 screws here. They're Torx head, and this is intended to be user serviceable. The rifle comes with a Torx tool for doing this. This one is actually the SCAR barrel removal tool because it's convenient here. So these 2 screws are also captive, which is a really good thing. In fact, I don't think any of the pins or screws on this rifle actually come completely out so that you can lose them on the ground. Everything's captive on the gun. Once I've pulled these 2 out, I can then pop the handguard off. This is very specifically intended to be a 0 holding handguard. So it is located in place by 2 rails down here, as well as 2 locating tabs here, and a 5th point of contact up here at the top. And then these 2 screws clamp it together. Obviously, that's what this slot with the stress relief hole is. And they clamp it onto a rather chunky barrel nut here. So it's worth pointing out, they have numbered these 1 and 2. The specific assembly process is you slide it on and then you tighten number 1 down all the way, and then you tighten number 2 afterwards. Number 1 is the specific, like having number 1 as a specific tighter tolerance attachment is what helps to ensure that you retain 0 when you remove and replace the handguard. Number 2 is to hold everything in position, but you can't really have both of them held to a super high tolerance, so that's why this one is, and it's specifically the first one that you have to retighten. All right, now the reason that I wanted to wait to show you the bolt carrier until we get to this point is because this is another significant deviation from the SCAR setup. The SCAR had a very long operating rod. It had a little tiny, basically a tappet gas piston out here, and the bolt carrier extended all the way out to it. They have made a specific choice to reduce the weight of the operating components to help reduce the felt recoil of the rifle, and that means chopping off the front of the operating rod, like the extension out here, and instead replacing it with a piston extension. So instead of being a typical, like dating all the way back to the Tokarev style of 3-part gas piston that we're used to seeing on guns like this, they have a single, very easily removable gas piston extension. And this is pretty cool. I like this thing. Its spring is captive. This is your actual piston itself, and that is removed from the front. So to take that out, I just push in the detent, rotate this down. This comes out, and there are your 2 identical gas ports. Once that's out, we can push the piston out. If you're familiar with the SCAR, you will notice that this is substantially larger in diameter than the SCAR piston. FN did find that there are actually some configurations and ammunition choices with the SCAR that could actually bend the piston. Not factory recommended configurations, of course, but people were able to figure out how to bend a SCAR piston. So for the ARKA, they scaled it up and made it substantially beefier. And like the SCAR, we've got 3 gas rings on the front end of the piston there. So this sits inside there, hooks onto that, and that pushes on the bolt carrier like so. Also, worth pointing out that they have a piece up here specifically to seal off this whole system. So there's no opportunity for dirt to make its way into the operating mechanism by way of the piston opening. The upper receiver otherwise is pretty much the same design as the SCAR, so it's an aluminum extrusion that has a steel rail screwed into it on the left side. That rail specifically is for the cam pin. This is what locks and unlocks the bolt, and you don't want a steel cam pin tracking on an aluminum receiver or you'll get very fast wear. So that's why you've got the screws for the steel internal rail. All right, we should definitely take the bolt the rest of the way apart. So we're going to start by taking out the firing pin retaining pin right there. So that does actually pop out completely. That is not retained. Then the firing pin comes out. Then we can take the cam pin out and the bolt out. Note the welding on the back here. This is hollow and filled with a metallic powder with some airspace. So it has the opportunity to bounce back and forth when the bolt closes, which effectively that is the anti-rebound system to prevent the bolt from bouncing open. You can also see the ejection port is slightly longer than the length of the bolt body. So there's this extra little tab here just to ensure that the ejection port is fully covered and closed off when the bolt's closed. So it's a nice simple bolt assembly. There isn't an extra firing pin block because the firing pin doesn't have enough inertia to need a proactive locking, extra set of locking components in order to be drop safe. Also worth pointing out, there is a little notch cut in the front of that locking lug. That's there specifically to give more positive engagement to the bolt hold open so that the bolt hold open doesn't ever release when you drop the rifle. If it's locked open. So that's kind of a neat little extra feature as well. Taking a look at the lower, we have not an AR fire control system. This is a fire control system very much like the SCAR. You'll notice they have the 2 little metal plates here. That also comes off of one of the improvements to the SCAR to make sure that it is not possible for cartridges, empty cases, to drop in there in case of a malfunction. All right, one of the other cool things here, kind of a side note from the firearm itself, but because of the magazine placement and the length of the receiver, there's a bit of open empty volume at the back end of the lower assembly. And this is specifically used for FN's what they call the Smart Core system, which is a built-in shot timer that uses the motion of the hammer spring here. So when I drop the hammer, of course, the guide rod for the hammer spring retracts. So as it's firing, that's going back and forth. And the shot counter is able to use the velocity and the energy in that to distinguish between live fire, blank fire, and just dry manipulation. So this is a system that's designed to track rounds fired, to allow an armorer to do a lot of proactive maintenance, parts ordering, and just general tracking of weapon condition. All right, so here you have the new FN Arca fully field stripped, which means I think it's time to take it out on the range and do some actual shooting. Alrighty, we are going to go ahead and start with the 14.5 inch with a suppressor on it. Let's see how it shoots. Now, for what it's worth, thanks to YouTube's regulations, I'm going to be sticking to just semi-auto in here. We'll do some separate video for places like Patreon and Pepperbox with full auto. But as far as semi-auto goes, this handles nicely. It shoots, frankly, like a lot of self-loading 5.56 service rifles. So well, let's put some more through it. All right, so a couple things about the handling. First off, this has a safety that can be engaged whether the hammer is up or down. So I've got the safety on right now, but it's loaded and chambered. Now, safety or hammer is down, and I can still engage the safety. So not all AR-15s do that. I think that's a good choice on FN's part. And then, of course, we can also lock the rifle open with one hand because the bolt release is, or bolt hold open, bolt release are ambidextrous. So, and your controls are in the same position to do the same thing with your left hand. All right, and now switching over to the short-barreled one. This is 11 1/4 and without the suppressor this time. You really do get the impression that the suppressor reduces the felt recoil a bit, which is nice. This absolutely has a heavier set of operating parts than an AR-15, and you feel that a little bit in the felt recoil. It is, as all things in firearms design, a trade-off. Heavier working parts mean more inertia and more momentum, which means better resilience when things start to get dirty or otherwise adverse conditions, which is part of why the gun doesn't need to have a separate adverse gas system setting. The trade-off is it doesn't feel like a tuned IPSC race gun, because a tuned IPSC race gun will go down the moment it gets 2 specks of dust in it. All right, guys, I would like to give a big thanks to FN for having me out here to take a look at the ARKA, to disassemble it, show it to you guys, and to do some shooting with it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.